So here are my completed heads ready to be put back together. I'm going to do an overview of the work I did to them and work you can do to heads in general. Some of it will be specific to this engine, which most people probably don't have anymore, but a lot of it will be general, so might be some good points in here. The first thing you need to do with a pair of heads, unless you're doing it as quick as possible just to get it sealing and running, at least take it to a machine shop and get the basic 3-angle valve job done, and if it needs it, resurfacing and stuff like that. I'd say a minimum of 3-angle if you want any kind of performance. It is very beneficial on the valve seats. 5-angle is nice too, or some places can do a radius cut, but there's probably not a whole lot of benefit. But at least a 3-angle, don't do a single angle because air doesn't flow around it quite as well. And then after that, you can get to some of the more basic stuff, a little bit performance oriented but not extremely time consuming, would be removing casting imperfections. Depending on the head you have, if it's for a mostly stock non-performance application, you'll probably have really sloppy castings like these were. And if I can get light in here. So these are my intake ports that I haven't polished or anything. I kind of just left a little rough. You can see I don't know if it's a seam along there where it looks like there were maybe a bottom and top half of the cast. There were big chunks of aluminum left over that were sticking out and stuff like that. So I went through and dremeled that all down, made it as smooth as possible. It's not too time consuming and it can help a little bit. So just try and remove the chunks sticking out or if there are any imperfections and stuff like that. Next, probably should do a gasket match as close as you can. And that's done by just, usually you stick the gasket on here and you see where extra metal sticks out into the space where the air is going to flow. And just remove it and try and blend it as well as you can. Here, where I did most of the gasket matching for the intakes, was this radius right here, because this was all smooth on the way in and it just came out flat, and the gasket came up a lot higher than that. This isn't blended very well. As you can see, it's kind of a little bit of a sharp radius there. It's not too bad, but since it's on the upside of the intake, or the short radius, it's not going to be as big of a deal. But you'd need to blend that more. Instead of just like a rounded edge, you'd want to have it more shaped further into the head and cut more material out to make it even smoother if it was on, say, this side. Since the air comes in and flows kind of down like this, the air's going to be pushing on this side or contacting it a lot more. But yeah, just gasket match as much as you can and try and make it to where there's no ridges or sharp points between surfaces, like where the gaskets go for your intake, or usually the closer it is to the valves, the bigger of a difference it'll make. So on the intake side and the exhaust side of your heads, the exhaust side usually doesn't matter because your exhaust manifold should be larger than the ports in your heads, so you won't really need to worry about it. But now if you have a weird case where maybe your exhaust manifold is smaller a little bit than your head ports, you'd want to do the opposite and gasket match your exhaust manifold so there's not a sharp corner, but the exhaust probably wouldn't be as big of a deal. And then after you do the basic machine work, you're removing your casting imperfections, gasket matching, you might want to go through, and I don't know if this engine was just like this or if it's really common, but the combustion chambers, as you can see, these I have smoothed out a lot compared to stock. And when it first came, there was like sharp cut edges around the valve seats here. And this was a ridge, and this was all just, this area here at the end of my thumb was all just flat and sharp. And there was a round ridge around the plug that stuck out past the plug a little bit. You'll want to remove as much of that as you can and just try and smooth it off. I mean, you don't want to actually remove material from your combustion chamber to, reduce compression, but it's better you get more air in and maybe reduce your compression 0.1% than have a sharp corner and stop air from flowing in better. So smooth those out as much as you can. and you can kind of see here, you could polish your combustion chamber to help, you know, carbon not stick to it and stuff flow around better, but probably wouldn't be too beneficial. You can see I dropped that this one completely down, and it's almost flat, and it kind of just tapers. Alright, getting more into the more involved, more time-consuming stuff, you might want to go through and in the ports themselves look for sharp edges. Like on mine, my exhaust ports, this is obviously after I'm done, but you can see around the port there's no edge where the valve seat ends anymore. There was, when it was stock, the ports like stuck out to here, and there was just a flat aluminum edge behind the valve seat. So I just went through with a Dremel and smoothed all of that off as much as I could. And then once you smooth that off, the exhaust side, the exhaust ports, you can polish, go crazy on if you want to. It won't give you a whole lot of benefit, but it should in theory help carbon from sticking to it. I didn't really polish mine a whole lot. I think I sanded down to like 220 grit and stopped there, and then just like went through with steel wool lightly. They're not like mirror polished, but they're very smooth to the touch, so it should be pretty decent. And another thing I did on these heads were the intakes had a section here, so you can see the real shiny part in front of the valve guide. They like stuck up. They were flat almost. It's a pretty good close-up. So all that I removed and tried to make it flush to where there was no ridge here. That ridge won't really matter, the one at the end of the valve seat, but since it's on the intake, it'll flow past it and it won't really cause any turbulence. But still, I dropped this sanded and polished area down as much as I could, as much as I felt comfortable with. I didn't want to risk going through the material and into the coolant jacket, so I stopped there. But I removed quite a bit of aluminum there. Tried to increase the long radius of the intake bowl, I think it's called. And that's just for this engine. I'm not sure if that's really common or not, but that should help airflow quite a bit. And then something else I removed that's engine specific, and I haven't saw it in anything else. These, you can see what I removed here. All of that flat area here didn't used to be flat. This, at the end of each intake valve guide, the channel, there was like a ridge that came up to here, all along there, and then stopped down at the beginning of the intake port. Now, I'm not sure what it was for. I'm guessing it just probably wasn't removed, and it was like casting leftovers. But it was a full ridge. It was the thickness of what you see there. So it took quite a while to remove. And just a pointer, if you're going to remove that much material, grinder bit would probably work, but you're going to go through a bunch. I'd recommend getting some stuff like this. These little guys, it's for a Dremel, and it's like a file. This is a tapered one. This is a flat one. And as you can see, some material, aluminum usually sticks and gums up in between there, and you'll have to scrape it out once in a while. And then here's like a ball file. I got a package of those three, and they were very useful for this, and they remove material much faster than a grinding bit. So yeah, there's that. And then I think that is what I wanted to show there. And then, oh yeah, last point, when it comes to polishing, I'd say polish like as a last resort. If you have a bunch of extra time, it probably won't give you much benefit, except for the exhaust. I mean, carbon might maybe stick to it and adhere to it less. But for the intakes, don't completely polish them, especially with mine. You can see this cutout here is where my injector sits. and it sits like this, and it's a split stream injector that shoots a stream like this. You can see on the opposite side, or kind of see, these clean spots here are where the injectors, the fuel vapor, or not vapor, the fuel actually contacts the intake port surface. You want to leave that smooth in theory so that it helps with, you know, the fuel not turning into liquid and staying liquid. It helps with fuel atomization. I mean, I'm not too sure about it. So, I mean, probably leave your intakes a little rough. I went ahead and mildly sanded the long radiuses, or long radii of my intakes, but I left them a little bit rough. Get a good view of it in here. It's kind of hard to have the flashlight at the right angle and the camera. And there's what the front of those, where I removed all that material from, looks like. There's still some dye left over from the valve job. I smoothed it out as much as I could. Here's another port. Oh, and one more thing. These, I'm not sure what they're called, these separators, the thing, this little guy that goes in between the ports, you can sharpen that. I tried to sharpen it a little bit, but it was hard to get stuff in there. It should help a little, and by sharpen I mean remove materials on you know, both sides, and then try and smooth out the corner if you can. But like I said, I didn't really on this one much because I couldn't get to it. I did, however, on the exhaust do a lot more. See if I can get enough light in here to see them. I have to hold it with my knee. So on the exhaust, you can see a little bit better of how I didn't really polish it, but I kind of just sanded it as well as I could. And the exhaust ports are smooth to the touch, but not really shiny and reflective. Yeah, there's those exhaust port separators that I kind of sharpened. I don't know if you can see the taper or not. Oops. Awkward angle. And those markings are left over from the hot tank. They some spots they discolored a little bit. Not really a big deal. One more quick point to make at the end here. The ports, when it comes to removing sharp edges, it depends on, keep in mind what direction the air is flowing. Like with the intake ports, there is a little bit of a ridge left here at the end of the seat. Now if that was the exhaust, I would have smoothed that out and tried to blend it in with the seat, but it doesn't really matter on the intake since the air is flowing past it, if that makes sense. So the air is going to come past it, and those ridges aren't going to matter. But on the exhaust, on the other hand, like I said about the removing this material, for mine it was on these two inside corners that I had to remove a bunch of material that was sticking out behind the valve seat. And I removed that because the air on the exhaust is flowing past it, so when the valve lifted and the air went to come past, it would hit that ridge and cause a little bit of turbulence or resistance. So keep that in mind when you see like ridges or things like that. If it's not against the airflow, it probably won't hurt anything, and except for the combustion chamber, because usually the air should be not flowing in a direct straight path. It should be, as it comes in, swirling. Or I'm not sure how it would work on a dual overhead cam engine, but the theory is that as the air comes in, it kind of swirls to fill up the chamber, and then as it compresses, when it's swirling, it ignites the fuel more evenly and more efficiently. But I'm not too sure how that changes with an engine like this. But yeah, just keep in mind, not every ridge is bad, but in the combustion chamber you should probably try and remove and smooth out as much as you can, like I said, without removing too much material. But I'd weight having smooth edges in a combustion chamber more importantly than worrying about removing, a couple thousandths and reducing your compression a tiny little bit. But yeah, that's what I did on my heads, and doubt anybody still has an engine like this, or if they do, they probably aren't too worried about doing this much work to it. But it's my first complete head job, if that's what you call it. So yeah, we'll see what it does. Do a quick look through on the ports. Trying to coordinate the flashlight with the camera. Here's a look at the intakes from the port side and that ridge that I removed, which was quite a bit of material to remove. I just tried to smooth it out and blend it as well as I could. And there's the top section on the long radius of the bowl that I dropped down and smoothed out a little bit. And these intake ports are kind of neat the way they don't come straight in and straight out like the exhaust does. They kind of go over to the side and fill up that outer corner. It's kind of neat. Here's a look at the unmodified factory heads that were taken off the engine when I rebuilt it. I pulled off two of the valves, one intake and one exhaust, so you could see into the bowls a little bit better. You can see how filthy the exhaust gets, and the intake, it gets cleaned by the fuel getting sprayed over it, but still pretty dirty. And as far as removing it, since the Kent Moore tool specifically designed for this engine doesn't work at all, this is just a motorcycle valve spring remover, and it needs to be the C-clamp style for an overhead cam engine like this. You can't fit a traditional valve spring compressor in it. And for mine, it's a 23mm adapter for the retainer that goes on the back, and you just twist it down, and they do stick a little bit, so usually you twist it down to where it's relieved, and then you smack on it a little bit, or maybe hit it with a rubber mallet, and it usually breaks free. And then I use this little guy I slightly magnetized to pull the little keepers out. Works pretty well. Putting them back's a little bit more tricky, but still doable. Alright, so here's a look at them, and you can see in the port here, let me grab the flashlight. So none of the carbon has been removed, but you can still see those chunks sticking out along the sides there. That's not carbon buildup, those are just casting imperfections left behind. And all that is stuff that you can remove from all of the ports. And then looking at the combustion chambers, here is before I smoothed everything out. You can see that along the outsides of the valves and stuff, they're just really sharp machined corners. I mean, it's like they cut them out and they just left the sharp machining marks there. And it's right around where the air flows around the valve, so smooth that out as much as you can, but try not to touch the actual valve seat. You want to leave those pretty much untouched. Even if you're not, whether you're going to have the valves done by a machine shop or not. And then here on the intake side, you can see the bowl, it sticks up a lot in here. You see how instead of being rounded, it kind of protrudes, the aluminum protrudes out into where the air would flow, and you can see where they, like this thing here, they machined it down a little bit, but then stopped. I took that and I used a Dremel and tried to make it flush with where they started machining it, and removed a bunch of aluminum out of there. You don't want to go too far because you can actually go through where that was cast, but you'd have to, cut out a ridiculous amount. And once I got flush here, I stopped, and you should be good there. And then from back here you can see that big ridge that sticks out in front of the retainer, where the valve seat, the valve stem guide, there we go, there's the word I was looking for, the valve stem guide goes. And that goes all the way out to the outer port, and it's really tall and really thick. I have no idea what it's for. You can really see that ridge on the upper intake bowl there from this angle. So yeah, just try and make that more round looking and then smooth it, blend it down. But then back to that ridge on the intake, just a minute. Here are those ridges, and I have no idea if they were left behind on purpose or not, if it was quicker to machine them this way, or cast them. See if I can get the light in there. But if they were done on purpose, the only thing I could imagine it's for is maybe for low RPM fuel efficiency, which this engine really is not specialized or designed for. So I mean, it's a lot of material to remove. I removed mine and smoothed them out as much as I could and made it look like a normal intake port. I mean, I don't know how much it cuts down on airflow, but you can see it's a huge ridge and it goes for the complete port. All the way from up beside the injectors up to there, so I don't know. And then you can see all the carbon buildup on the intake. And it's hard to tell, some of those chunks might be carbon sticking out, some of them might be actual aluminum left behind from the casting process. And I haven't cleaned these at all, so once again it's really hard to tell, but a lot of it's probably aluminum. Okay, and that was the intake port, or the port work I did, exhaust and intake. The exhaust mostly I just pretty much just smoothed it out, and then I took this, oh, this is going to be hard to hold. For the exhaust, I pretty much just, I tried to smooth down this center divider, open it up a little bit, and then make that, I mean there's a lot of aluminum there, so it would take a really long time to make that a knife edge in the center, but I mean, you could go for it. But mostly for the exhaust, I just smoothed up the casting imperfections. Oh, and also, the exhaust has a bit of a ridge sticking out too. If you can see on the right side there, if I can get the light to work right, how I want it to. See how that part of the aluminum protrudes out into where the air would be flowing on the right hand side? It was machined down a little. But yeah, I smoothed that out, and then basically, I mean, looking at it, for the intake bowls, like I said, for the work that I did, just anything that sticks out into the port on the exhaust, you definitely want to smooth off. And on the intake side, I mean, you just want to open it up as much as you can, and especially the long radius of the upper bowl, you want to have that as rounded and smooth as possible. But on the intakes, you also want to keep it a little rough around where the fuel goes. And you can see that on these uncleaned ones, the fuel goes right there. You can see where the injectors spray, where there's no carbon buildup. And one more thing to note, on the let's see, on the exhaust side here, notice these valve stem seals, the rubber little guys. This one just is completely fallen off, and this one is smashed up really bad. I don't know if you can see it through the spring, and I'm not sure why it happens, but if I flip over to the exhaust here, try and hold it with my leg. So if I flip over to the exhaust here, notice how that valve stem seat, or the valve stem guide, sticks out into the combustion chamber. It's not supposed to. It's supposed to be nearly flush. Like that one sticks out a little bit. Let's see. This one over here looks pretty good. That's about what it's supposed to look like, not sticking out any at all. That one has drooped a little bit. And I'm guessing it's from where GM lets these engines run so hot that, I mean, the aluminum gets warm enough and expands around that guide, and it just allows the guide to fall down with gravity when it's hot. And then when that happens, well, these little rubber seals just are pressed onto the back of the guide, so when the guide falls down into the port, those have nothing to stick onto and they just fall off and kind of float around on the valve stem, and they can get smashed up and stuff. Now, I'm not sure how important they are because this engine, at least it wasn't burning a noticeable amount of oil, and at least 2 of those were smashed. The other head might have a few too, so not too sure on how important it actually is, but just something I noticed. It's another reason to try and let these run as cool as possible. But yeah, there's just a look at the factory head and some of the stuff, that how it looks before you modified it, or before I smoothed it off and removed a bunch of material. Okay, this is just a few more head assembly pointers and tips. Most of it's engine specific though. So for these top seal things that go on the back of the valve stem guides, they go almost flush, if I can get the right focus. They go almost flush with the that washer, and then I used a 7/16 socket because it fit over them about right, almost completely flush, so you can get a nice flat surface without having to smack on that. And then just a piece of wood and tap it on with a hammer or a mallet or something. And then when it comes to the valves, as far as removing them was concerned, this engine actually has a toolkit, quote-unquote special service toolkit. So this thing, the valve spring compressor that it comes with, it's supposed to be for this engine specifically. It seems to work for the valve springs, but the issue is, obviously there's not enough room to get those claws under the valve spring when they're on the head and you're trying to remove the springs, because, well, there's no room. And there's this crap sticks up around the outside of the spring, so you can't get to the surface like on a normal engine. So you pretty much have to get some type of C-clamp valve spring compressor. Unless I have completely missed a point here, this thing was designed just wrong. This is a valve spring for the engine it was designed for, the GM 3.4 liter dual overhead cam V6. And this is, as you can see, bottomed out all the way, as much as it extends. And how's that supposed to work? So what, I have to compress it by hand and then let it do the rest of its job? I don't understand what this is. Like, is this some kind of joke? Yeah, I just thought I'd share that, because I mean, you can see that as you turn it, I'm going in the wrong direction, aren't I? So as you turn it this way, it opens up the jaws, but I mean, no matter what, they're too short to encompass the whole spring. So I mean, you can't even get the spring on there, and even if it worked for this, it's completely useless for removing the springs when they're actually on the heads. So it's only half effective at best. So I just thought I'd share that. If anybody still has this engine, the toolkit is necessary, at least for the timing components, but the valve spring compressor is a total joke. It's not even close. I mean, if you had really, really short valve springs, and these are stock factory valve springs. So yep, there's that.